What can be done to reduce acid rain? To reduce acid rain, we must reduce the NOx and the SO2 emissions. Here's a figure showing the NOx emissions since the 1970s. 1970, the NOx emissions were about at their peak, and you see they remained fairly stagnant for about 20 years, and then after 1990, when the Clean Air Act went into effect, we start to see a reduction. Let's think of what happens to reduce the NOx concentrations. First, we have to remember where NOx is coming from, and it's largely coming from automobiles. The technology that has been developed to reduce NOx emissions from automobiles is the catalytic converter. So the catalytic converter reduces the concentration of NOx, VOCs, and carbon monoxide. Additionally, we have continual improvements made in car emissions. And in the last 10 years or so, we also have the emergence of more hybrid and electric cars that reduce the emissions of NOx. We can also get NOx from coal-fired power plants because remember, this reaction takes place anytime we have high heat. So technologies that have been introduced to reduce pollution from coal-fired power plants also reduce the NOx concentrations. Note that there has been a reduction in NOx concentrations and NOx emissions despite the fact that we have more highway miles driven than ever in the US. So this is not the result of more people taking alternative means of transportation. This is a result of improving technology to reduce emissions. The other big source of acid rain is SO2 emissions. And you see with SO2 emissions, we've had a dramatic decrease over the last 40 years. This decrease is due to several things. Keep in mind that SO2 emissions are largely from coal-fired power plants and from other industries that burn coal. So, if we want to have less sulfur dioxide emissions, we can use coal that contains less sulfur. We can also wash the coal so that we get less pollution coming out. And we can introduce scrubbers that chemically remove the sulfur dioxide from the smokestack before it goes into the atmosphere. These are all technologies that have been instrumental in decreasing the sulfur dioxide concentration and therefore decreasing acid rain. Some of these methods also reduce other pollutants such as mercury. Let's compare the emissions of NOx and sulfur dioxide in the US over the last 40 years. You will see that the concentrations of both have decreased over time. But which pollutant has decreased more? If you look at the scale here, we see that the NOx emissions have decreased from about 28 million short tons to about 12 million short tons, whereas the sulfur dioxide emissions have been reduced from about 30 million short tons to less than 10 million short tons. So we see a much greater reduction in the sulfur dioxide emissions than that in NOx. I want you to think about some reasons that the reduction in sulfur dioxide has been more dramatic than the reduction of NOx. Sulfur dioxide emissions are largely coming from big industries like power plants or other industries that use coal. It's easier to regulate point sources, so these big sources of emissions, than it is to regulate individuals. When the NOx emissions are largely coming from cars, that means we have a lot of small users that are contributing to the problem. So the government-led regulations for sulfur dioxide reductions have led to a much more dramatic decrease over time. This illustrates the decrease in sulfate concentrations over time from 1985 to 2008. And you see the pollution was centralized in the Midwest and the Northeast where we saw the highest concentrations of acid rain. And in this time period, we saw a 25% reduction in sulfur dioxide emissions in the US. This has led to a major reduction in acid rain. The United States and Western Europe have seen dramatic reductions in NOx and SO2. But now Asia leads the sulfur dioxide emissions. China has begun to close some of its older and more inefficient coal plants and is installing new technology. So they have seen some reductions in sulfur dioxide emissions since 2006. But as China's economy continues to grow, we can expect to see more car ownership, and the NOx pollution could become worse. Acid rain is still a very serious problem in much of the world, especially in Asia and China and India.